Hello, and thank you for attending today's Balancing Work and Cancer webinar entitled Balancing Work and Cancer. So before we begin, a few housekeeping items related to accreditation. And for those of you who don't require this information, please bear with me. I promise I will be as fast as possible. Today's webinar is accredited for CEUs by ANCC, the California Board of Registered Nursing, the National Association of Social Workers, the New York State Education Department's State Board for Social Work, and the Society for Human Resource Management. If you plan on receiving continuing education credit for this program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must call in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and post-test, as well as receive a passing grade on the post-test. Following today's session, you'll receive an email with all of this information. That will be sent by 5 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, and certificates will be emailed within 4 to 6 weeks. Also, please note that the planners and presenters for this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and that no commercial support was provided for this program. The Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series is sponsored in part by a generous grant from Genentech. We are also grateful for the tremendous contributions provided by HSN and QVC. Additionally, Cancer and Careers year-round sponsors support all of CAC's core programs, including this one. My name is Rachel Becker. I am Senior Director of Programs for Cancer and Careers, and I will be your host and presenter for today's session. So as I mentioned, our topic for today is specifically balancing work and cancer, and we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about the various considerations, practical, legal, that sit at the intersection of these two entities. And it's a very big topic. We could spend an entire day talking about this. In fact, we often do. We have a conference, a West Coast conference on work and cancer that's coming up in October for those of you who might be interested in spending the full day with us talking about these issues. But for today, we're going to touch on a lot of these topics just so you can get a sense of what to be thinking about and where you might go to find more information after today. And I would imagine that those of you who are sitting in on this call are in really different places in terms of your cancer experience. We likely have people dialed in who are pre-treatment. Some of you might be in treatment and have already made a lot of decisions about how to balance work and cancer in your own lives and are experts in your own right by virtue of having done that. We also probably have some people who are post-treatment, maybe many years post-treatment and into the recovery process. And then of course, we have healthcare professionals as well as employers and caregivers as well frequently on these sessions. So wherever you might be in this journey, we hope that you will find something today to take with you. And again, that wherever you might be on this journey today, you are able to recognize that a lot of questions come up when we start thinking about this topic of balancing work and cancer. And when we think about how work starts to factor in, those questions can feel kind of challenging to answer. Often things feel like they're in conflict with one another, there are competing priorities to consider, and it can be understandably overwhelming. So what we recommend in order to kind of get a hold of all of this is to take a step back and start to look at the big picture and think about how we can start to carve a path forward that's going to make the most sense for you as an individual in your specific circumstances. And to start this process, there are two overarching questions that are worth considering that can help to really start to pave that path. The first is, how important is work to you personally? And the second is, what information do you need to have maybe physically in front of you even in order to make good decisions about work? And this consideration might happen when you're newly diagnosed and trying to create that initial roadmap through a landscape. But these questions can also come up at various other points throughout the treatment experience and into the post-treatment experience as well, as as different treatment progresses, as appointments are ongoing for monitoring. Your experience is going to dictate what feels realistic for you, what's comfortable for you, and what your preferences are. Now, when we think about the first stages of making these choices, there are other questions that come into view once we ask those first two initial questions about importance of information. The first is thinking about how treatment is going to affect work and schedule. Is it going to be necessary to take time off for surgery and treatment? Is your team telling you that the chemotherapy protocol that you're on is likely to lead to exhaustion or some sort of other fatigue that might be at odds with your ability to be productive at work? Is there a way that you can map those out and kind of plan your work life around when you'll be feeling better? Do you know that you're going to be receiving a treatment, chemotherapy, or maybe you are receiving a chemo that makes you start to feel pretty bad right away while you're still sitting in the chair? Or are you taking one that has more of a delayed reaction and the side effects are more than a couple days late, come in a couple days later? In that first case, you might want to think about seeing if you can schedule your infusions to happen on a Friday, so the weekends right now for you to rest and recover. If you have a more delayed reaction, perhaps it's scheduling for a Wednesday, so you have those couple of days before you start feeling your worst. But it's really about taking the time to think through, talk to your healthcare team, and understand what might work best for you, and then being proactive to create that schedule. Also thinking about what actually goes into working. Many of us are, of course, still working from home during this ongoing pandemic that we're facing, but many places are also opening back up. And so we're hearing a lot more about commutes beginning to happen again. That's something that's realistic for you, right? If you work a 9 to 5 workday, for example, but you know that you have an hour and a half commute and you do that in rush hour traffic in each way, you have to sit in rush hour traffic for an hour and a half each way, that 9 to 5 workday actually starts at 7:30 a.m. and it ends at 6:30 p.m. So that's an 11-hour day. Are you going to be able to sustain that throughout the course of treatment with side effects that may be happening? And of course, no person is only their diagnosis and their job. So what other responsibilities are there to take into consideration? Are there kids that need help with their homework? Are there aging parents that you're responsible for caring for? Is there a painting class that you've just started taking that's been really fortifying and helping you to feel more like yourself, that might work as a coping mechanism as you're going through all of this? How can you divide up your resources, your internal energy, and your time so that you are able to balance all of the things in life that you want to balance besides simply your job and your treatment? Also thinking about how flexible your work environment might be. Thinking about whether telecommuting might be possible. Again, we're still in a period of time where a lot of us have learned a whole lot about what telecommuting means and how possible it is. But if you are in an in-person working environment, perhaps explore going back to a working remote environment for the sake of being able to manage your side effects during treatment, if that's right for you. We're going to talk more about this topic in a little bit when we get to the moment where we're discussing what it's like to work through treatment. But it's an important consideration. And then, of course, for many people, financial and insurance needs are also a very important consideration when they're thinking about whether or not to work during treatment. In fact, for many, financial and insurance needs are the key decision driver for them in deciding whether or not they're going to work during treatment. Of course, that's not true for everyone. For some people, it is important, but not the most important thing. And for some people, it's really not the critical component at all. For many people, particularly in this country, work is who they are. If you think about the experience of meeting a new person in your life, the first question that we typically ask is, what do you do? Right? And that's a particularly profound question if you stop to think about it. So if you've received a diagnosis and you're sitting there and your healthcare team is telling you that you might not be able to work or that your ability to work might be compromised in some way, when you feel pretty emotional about that and it feels kind of upsetting, you're not alone. A lot of people have that experience, that kind of piece of their identity impacted by their treatment. And so again, this is why it's important to talk to your healthcare team about what's going on and how you feel about this, not just what's practical, but what your emotions are, so that they can understand where you're coming from. And so that you can maybe get a social worker involved or caretakers, your personal family and friends who are jumping in to take care of you, so that you can come up with a plan for self-care as you're going through this process. Now, you'll remember I just mentioned gathering information as an important component as making a decision about whether or not to work during treatment. And this slide breaks down into 3 buckets, the types of information that you may want to collect. So we just spent some time talking about that first bucket. It is medical and treatment information. And it is really important to understand the timeline of the treatment options and what your healthcare team is recommending, and then really to get input from all of the members of your healthcare team and kind of weigh it together so that you can then make the decision that works best and feels right for you. The second bucket is workplace information, such as what paid leave you might have available, such as, sick days or vacation days, what insurance policies might have in place, as well as those pre-existing flexibility options like telecommuting or shifting around your schedule. Again, we'll talk more about those. And then also critical is this third bucket, and that has to do with legal fact finding in advance. So taking some time to understand which state and federal protections you might be entitled to at work can be a really important part of the process. And we say this not because we think that the situation is likely to become litigious, but rather because practical and legal concerns tend not to exist in separate vacuums. Often where there is a practical concern, there is a law that addresses it, that provides protections and actually exists as a kind of tool to help you address it. And conversely, what good is there having a law providing protections if you don't practically know how to apply it? So that's one of the goals here for today's session, is to help you understand the way in which the law can exist as a tool so that it doesn't feel like something that we need to live in fear of, but something that can be implemented as maybe even the critical component that helps make working during all or part of treatment possible. So for the purposes of today, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a critical law. It's often the key tool in helping to navigate work after cancer. And my goal here is to give you a little bit of a background on the ADA so that you know that it's something that's there and something to maybe to look further into based on your own situation. I do want to give the caveat to begin with that I am not an attorney. My background is in social work. That's what my master's degree is in. And so I have a general understanding of the law and I can answer some questions about it, but when we get to the Q&A period, I may not be able to answer all of your hardball legal questions. And if you do have questions about how the law might be applied specifically in your situation, it's really critical to find a legal expert, whether that's an attorney or a nonprofit somewhere that specializes in this kind of thing, that can help you really understand the ins and outs of the law. But back to the ADA. So to start with, the ADA is a federal law, meaning that it applies in all 50 states. And the part that is relevant to work in cancer comes from Title I. And like all laws, it has certain requirements that must be met in order to use it. So in broad strokes, those requirements are, first, that your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. Second is that you personally must have the necessary skills, certifications, and qualifications to do the job in which you're working. And the third is that your disability must meet the criteria that have been identified by the ADA as meeting the definition of having a disability. And if you have all of these requirements, the ADA provides protections from discrimination, and it may also provide access to reasonable accommodations. And we're going to spend more time talking about those very shortly. And so again, this is just a quick overview so that you know what the ADA is, you know that it's something to consider. And I do also want to mention quickly before we move on here that you may be further protected by state fair employment laws in your specific state. So basically, every state in the US has a specific set of employment laws that they've created for that state. And in some cases, they expand on those protections. For example, often the state fair employment laws will drop down the number of employees that an employer is required to have. For example, I know that in Illinois, the requirement is only one. So if you work at an organization that has one employee, you're protected by the state fair employment laws. So the point there is to make sure that you're taking a look and understanding what the state fair employment laws are as well, if you are considering legal protections and how they might benefit you. Okay. Now, before we actually start thinking about the workplace specifically and what it's like to exist in the workplace while we're balancing a cancer diagnosis, I want to take some time to talk about the online space. And before this all started, we traveled a lot. Cancer and Careers traveled a lot, and all over the United States. I personally have presented in 35 states across this country. And of course, our virtual programs reach patients and survivors in all 50 states. And we hear a lot about how important the internet is in the survivorship experience for so many people, right? It provides a way to connect. I hear about people, waking up at kind of 3 o'clock in the morning and feeling a little bit alone and being able to go online and connect and feel a little bit less alone. So I want to acknowledge, as we're talking about the online space, that there is this important role, and that at no point over the next couple of slides am I saying that you should stay away from the internet space or that you shouldn't communicate in the space in the way that feels right for you. But I do want to point out that the internet, when we post things online, when we maintain a blog, when we contribute to chat forums, we're creating a written record of information that can be difficult to get rid of. And research also is showing us that more and more employers and hiring managers Google their employees and prospective candidates. And this is not necessarily done with any sort of malicious intent. It's usually done to get additional information about, the people that the employers has working for them, or for a hiring manager to confirm something that they already like about a particular candidate. But it's still possible that they'll come across information that the person would prefer that the employer didn't know. And so the idea here is to really give you a sense about how you can be in control of the narrative that's presented of you online, how you can be aware of it, and feel like you have your foot on the gas in terms of the way that your story is being presented online, so that it doesn't have a negative impact in the workplace. And again, it's not everyone who experiences this. It's not a guaranteed issue, but it's good to know. It's good to have a sense of these things. Now, some of you might be thinking that, I'm always very careful with my privacy settings, right? I make sure that my account is locked down. So doesn't that mean that I'm fully protected? And the answer to that question is, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So absolutely a good idea to understand the privacy policies of the websites that you're using, but it's also, and to set your settings so that they're in a place that are comfortable for you, right? So that if you have your settings as private as possible, if that's something that's important to you. But it's also key to know that those policies are constantly changing. And that's because Facebook and other mainstream social media sites like it they make their money off of advertisers, and they're designed to sell us things. And so in order to keep making new deals with those advertisers, they often change their privacy policies. And often this is done without notice. So you could take time to make sure that all of your privacy settings are fully touched on, that you're as protected as you could possibly be. And then the next day you could log on and find that something's changed and your profile isn't as secure as you had thought. Now, of course, the plus side of this is that none of us have to pay to use Facebook or Instagram. And so all of those beautiful benefits of staying socially connected come to us without charge. But it can be pretty impractical and time consuming in order to try to stay on top of those policies and keep your privacy settings locked down. So as an alternative, you might consider using the two sites that you see listed on this slide. They're called My Lifeline and Caring Bridge. I'm sure that many, if not all of you, are already familiar with them. Both are social networking sites that are specifically designed to be a safe space to share updates about what's going on with your cancer experience or any medical experience, really. They're a more controlled environment. They have a higher level of privacy than mainstream social media networks. But while their policies are easier to follow, profiles are not 100% automatically protected. So if you're going to use these sites, it's worth taking the time to read through those privacy policies as well, figure out what the protections are that are offered by each level of security and which one is going to work best for you. And then, of course, there are ways to purposely shape the way that your story is told in an online way. And these include things like developing a personal disclosure plan. That's making decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to share either online or offline, and where you're going to share it in terms of specific websites and blogs, etc. And then, of course, once you've made those decisions, you're going to want to communicate those out to the people around you. I can't tell you how many times we've heard stories from people about their very loving, very well-meaning siblings or cousins or parents who are trying to be cheerleaders, and their version of doing this involves posting online about the patient's experience, with what they're going through. And that patient themselves, that survivor themselves, did not want that information to be made public and online. So making sure that everyone around you knows what to post and what not to post as well. And I'm sure that there may be some of you as well who are thinking, well, I have a job I love. I've been here for years. My supervisor is being super supportive, and I really don't have any concerns about them knowing what my circumstance is. And if that is true for you, I think that's wonderful. But I would encourage you to think about the fact that none of us really know what's going to happen in the future. And so it's entirely possible that your really understanding and super supportive supervisor is going to find another position and be replaced by a manager who is less understanding and doesn't really understand what it means to have cancer and that you can still be a productive member of a team. You also might find yourself unexpectedly looking for work at some point, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and not want to have that information posted online. So again, it's just really about, thinking through some of these decisions and so that you can really feel in control of the way that your story is being told. There are also plenty of options to, take control of what comes up about you in a search. Strategically posting on sites like LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter, these will come up in early search results with your name. And so they will provide something for hiring managers to click on besides whatever information might be out there that you would prefer that they didn't see, like say a newspaper interview, etc. Setting up a professional web page or blog similarly, and then also deleting old posts that no longer represent your interests. They might still exist somewhere in cyberspace, but they become harder to find. And at Cancer and Careers, we do have an hour-long webinar on building a professional online brand that is archived on our website. If you would like to know more about steps that you can take, please go take a look at that. It's a great hour. Now I'd like to shift back to the workplace by sharing some data points that help to paint that landscape. And these bullet points are drawn from our 2019 Harris poll. And so at the top there, you will see the top 5 reasons that were identified by survey respondents as to why they continued working after a diagnosis. The group that was surveyed in this particular instance were all people who had continued working after their diagnosis. And you can see that the top 5 reasons were: first, they wanted things to feel normal. Number 2 was wanting to feel productive. 3, work provided a routine. 4, it kept or keeps their mind off of cancer. And then 5 was that it helped them to And what's really significant to me about these findings, and perhaps jumps out to you as well, is that health insurance and finances are not included in this top 5. They were options, they were on the list, they got chosen, but they didn't make it into the top 5. And so that really supports the point that I was making earlier, that for so many people, continuing to work is because it's continuing to be part of who we are. We also found that 75% of surveyed patients and survivors felt that working during treatment helps or helped them to cope. And then 74% of surveyed patients and survivors said that work aided in their treatment and recovery. Now, this question is one of the most common that we're asked at Cancer and Careers, and that is, do I have to share the news of my diagnosis at work? Now, when it comes to disclosing at work, like the rest of decisions around sharing the news, it's very, very personal, and it's one that should require some thought, but it's also important to know that it's typically not an all or nothing scenario. But just so we are on the same page, generally speaking, you're not required to provide information about your health or your health history to either a current employer or to a prospective employer, nor can they ask. And that's generally speaking. There are some situations where you might need to share some information in order to access your rights under the law. But even if that's the case, it doesn't mean you have to share every single last minute detail about your diagnosis or your prognosis. It just means you might have to provide some support for why you're eligible to ask for what you're asking for. So as you're thinking about whether or not to share, it's important to consider all of those angles. And to remember that you can always say more later, but once something's been shared, it's like trying to get toothpaste back in the tube. It's pretty challenging to do. Now, when we're thinking through how to make a disclosure at work, there are 2 major things to consider overall. The first, how is treatment going to interfere with your ability to perform your job duties? And then the second, what legal benefits are there to telling? Might you access reasonable accommodations, protections under the laws we just discussed? We're going to talk more about those soon. But it's also important, there are other considerations that you might want to think through when you're deciding whether or not or how to share. So consider your work environment. Is your company culture one that feels safe and flexible, right? Is it a place where people show up on Mondays and stand around the water cooler and show pictures of their grandkids and talk about what they did with their weekend, and it kind of feels like a family? Or are you working in an environment that's more formal and buttoned up and competitive? A lot of financial institutions or corporate settings are often this way. That could influence whether you decide to share, how much information you decide to share. So important to spend some time thinking that through. Also considering what your performance has been like up to this point, right? Do you have a great track record, or do you have a poor performance reviews that you're kind of trying to fight against? If you have poor performance reviews, for some people, that's a reason to explain that, this is what they're going through. They're going through treatment, that it's causing them to have fatigue, because that provides some context as to why maybe a work performance that had been improving for a while is now no longer improving. It answers questions so that your employer isn't answering those questions by themselves, perhaps coming to unflattering conclusions. Thinking about how others might have been treated in similar situations pertaining to their health or the health of their family members, that can help you think about, that can be very informative when you consider the way that a disclosure conversation might go. So for example, maybe you don't know of anyone who went through a cancer experience, but you do know that you had a colleague who went out on maternity leave. What was that like? Were they fully supportive and everybody was right on board and willing to pitch in extra if needed and help out in whatever way possible? Or was there grumbling behind their back? That can inform how you shape the message, how you deliver the message. And of course, your own personality should come into play as well here, because everyone reacts differently to the news of a cancer diagnosis. Neither of them are good or right or better than anything else. None of them are wrong. But knowing how you feel about communicating this information, right? Some people are sharers. Some people are just not going to feel like themselves if they are not telling their colleagues what is going on with them. Some people are distinctively not sharers, and even if they are in a very sharey workplace, that is not how they operate and how they roll. And medical information is often something that people feel very protective about, specifically in a way that's different from the way that they share other information about their lives. So what is it for you? How's that going to factor in? From there, if you have decided to tell, the next challenge is thinking about who to tell. For many people, that is going to be their direct supervisor. That is someone with whom they already have a direct open line of communication, somebody that they feel the most comfortable talking to. For others, it may be their HR department, maybe because they're not as comfortable with their supervisor, or possibly because there's a policy in place that says that you have to go to HR first with something like this. So understanding what that handbook says about the requirements is important. And then, of course, taking into consideration the fact that you may have to have more than one conversation. So prepare yourself in case that is the way that things go, right? You may tell your supervisor and your supervisor says go to HR, or vice versa, etc. And then finally, if you decide that you do want to share with your coworkers, the best approach there is to let them know what to expect. Any plans for work coverage if you're going to be away. It really can help you feel more in control to head off some questions rather than be caught by them unexpectedly. But whoever you're speaking with, it's important to prepare for the conversation beforehand so that you hit all of the important points that you want to make. And then also work in the idea that treatment is fluid. And that what you know at the moment in time that you are talking about your treatment and what it's likely to entail or what it's already entailing, that's what's true today. But as I'm sure many of us on this call can relate to, things change. Treatment progresses, side effects can snowball, and there's no way to really know how that's all going to go until we're living through it and seeing what's happening. So communicating the idea that it's fluid, that what you are sharing today is what it's true today, and that you intend to continue having the conversation, continuing to communicate the reality of the circumstances as they unfold. With that said, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling in terms of a conversation at work is one that can be intimidating for a lot of people. It's completely understandable. So on this slide, we provided a couple of examples of how you might start that conversation. But overall, as you're preparing to start these talks, you want to weave in the idea that you are eager to collaborate with your employer to create a plan that ensures both your needs and their needs are being met. And at Cancer and Careers, we've also created a publication that we call our Manager's Kit. That the link at the bottom of the screen goes to our website where you can download that as a PDF for free. And that is designed for you to actually bring into your employer, to hand them a copy of it and say, let's figure this out together. And I found this awesome publication that lists some of the considerations for employers to be thinking through when they're supervising someone who has cancer. Now, when we think about side effects at work, it's critical to prepare yourself for potential side effects for a variety of reasons. Clearly, anything that's going to impact your comfort level is something that you want to make sure that you're addressing so that you can stay as productive as possible while you're working. But it's also important to have conversations with your healthcare team about what you might expect in terms of side effects, both for the comfort and also because if you've made a decision not to disclose your cancer in the workplace, not using your words, I should say, that you don't want to talk about it, it's possible that your physical changes may disclose something even if your words don't. So for example, if you start losing a tremendous amount of weight, if you start losing your hair, these are the kinds of things that can invite questions from colleagues. And usually coworkers are coming with these questions because they're concerned, they care, they want to find out what's going on. But if you're not prepared to answer those questions, you might find yourself accidentally disclosing what's going on with your health, even if you hadn't intended to beforehand. So we're going to talk about preparing responses to questions shortly, but I did want to float that this is an important piece of the disclosure planning process, is thinking about how your side effects may disclose for you. Now, while we're talking about side effects, we definitely want to spend some time discussing chemo brain, as without question, it is the side effect we're most frequently asked about at Cancer and Careers. And when it comes to thinking about how to manage chemo brain on the job, it's important to consider that really there are no magic bullet solutions. It's really about going back to basics, addressing your individual symptoms, because every chemo brain is not the same for everybody, and to just take things one step at a time. So some suggestions that we have, we encourage you to forget about multitasking. We live in this culture where there are so many distractions that pop up and pull our attention from one place to the next. And there's this sort of myth perpetuating that we're good at multitasking because we can look at our phone and we can do this and we can do that, the other thing all at the same time. But the reality is that the human brain is really not so very much designed for multitasking. And so really turning off distracting notifications, focusing on one thing at a time, and knowing that that is true, that is the best practice for the majority of people, regardless of what their age is or what their health circumstances are, etc. Second suggestion is to write down a list of priorities so that you know what you're doing and when. You're not relying on your memory to keep track of what the priorities for your time are. Schedule meetings with yourself. If you work in an environment that you're on a computer and there's a shared calendar kind of setting, we have a lot of people that we work with who will set meetings on the calendar with themselves, and then let their colleagues know from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., I'm going to turn off my email, I'm going to not answer my phone, and I'm going to focus on this particular project. But then 3 p.m., I'm back online, I'm back in the game and answering questions and there for any discussions that might need to happen. It takes away the pressure to respond. Writing everything down is a great idea. It helps you to have a written record. It's also the act of writing itself, actually holding a pen in your hands and putting it to paper and writing things down can help you remember. There have been a lot of studies that have demonstrated this. We also recommend rehearsing presentations, project updates, phone calls, any sort of spoken piece of text that you may need to work through as part of your day. Practicing in advance can be helpful. And then, of course, managing your stress, because stress in and of itself, anxiety, can often impede our ability to focus. And so building small breaks into your day, or maybe that means getting outside and walking around a little bit. Maybe it means spending 2 minutes watching a YouTube video of a waterfall or ocean waves coming in, something that's just going to help reset your brain, right? A little can go a long way in terms of refocusing. It's also helpful to think about how communications with supervisors and coworkers can help to navigate through these moments. So asking for written priorities and creating a plan, right? We talked about creating a written list of priorities and actually doing that and then chatting through it with your supervisor so that everybody's on the same page. That can go a long way in helping to reduce that stress and making sure that you feel organized for your day. Also, identifying a point person maybe who can answer questions about your health and how you're feeling, so that if you're coming back after 3 or 4 weeks away, you're not having to spend a lot of time, catching people up on how you're feeling and things of that nature. And then also knowing your limits and setting boundaries and knowing how to say no, right? Because often we're asked to take on extra projects that fall outside of our day-to-day requirements of our job. And it is completely reasonable and it is completely okay to say, no, I have a lot going on right now. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to say, well, I'm going through cancer and I don't have the energy. People say taking on extra projects in professional environments for all sorts of reasons. And we have two examples of how to execute the professional no on this slide. We also have a webinar on communicating effectively that is coming up later this year. It is going to be entirely focused on communication skills in the workplace. So if you are interested in learning more about that, spending a full hour diving into it, I encourage you to sign up for that webinar. So now we've gotten to the moment where we're going to discuss reasonable accommodations as promised. And reasonable accommodations, you'll remember, they're one of the protections that you may be entitled to under the ADA if you qualify for protections under the ADA. And reasonable accommodations are modifications to your job, your schedule, or the environment that you work in that make it possible for you to perform your essential duties. And they may also be available during the job search process. So rather than spending too much time talking through what those mean, I'm going to provide you with some examples to illustrate what a reasonable accommodation might look like. So our first example is Sue. Sue was a hospital social worker, and she is somebody who loved her job. She loved working, and for her, being on her job very much helped her to feel like herself during treatment. However, she noticed that when she was at work, she would experience really, really severe, debilitating nausea. Now, obviously, that's not a terribly unusual side effect for someone who's going through chemotherapy. But what was odd for Sue was that she was not experiencing that same debilitating level of nausea when she was at home on the weekends. And she was also not experiencing it in the evenings either. And so, we had a couple of conversations with her. We asked her a bunch of questions. And what we ultimately discovered was that Sue's office was right next to the cafeteria. And so the smells of the cooking food were wafting in all day, and that was making her feel nauseated. So for her, a reasonable accommodation was to switch offices with someone so that she could be further away from the cafeteria and she did not have to deal with those smells. And that, in fact, did help to lessen the nausea that she was experiencing. Frank was somebody who worked in a large corporate environment. He had a job working with a financial team where he was printing out a lot of papers. And for whatever reason, the person who had designed this environment had connected his computer to a printer that was 2 floors down from where his desk was. And so whenever he printed a document, he would have to climb down 2 sets of stairs, and then he would have to go back up 2 sets of stairs. And so for him, the reasonable accommodation was for the company to purchase a printer that could sit near his workstation so that he did not have to be walking around all the time. And that helped him with managing his fatigue during the workday. So as you can see, there's no one size fits all reasonable accommodation. It's really about looking at the specific circumstances and the specific requirements of the job and the side effects, and thinking about a practical, reasonable solution that's going to work in that unique scenario. And then on this slide, we have identified a number of questions that you can ask yourself in order to identify other potential reasonable accommodations. Could you shift around your hours and your schedule? So maybe, if you know that you feel better and can be more productive in the morning, maybe instead of working 9 to 5, you work 7 to 3. Maybe you take more breaks throughout the day, or, somebody who's an usher in a movie theater might perhaps request a stool so that they can sit and take tickets and tear tickets in order to, not be standing all day. Again, it's really about running through the specifics of what's going to work for you. And also important to know that in most cases, reasonable accommodations cost an employer $500 or less. And the or less is really the key part there, because many of them come at no cost, right? Switching an office has no cost associated with it. So there are ways to come up with these solutions that are not taxing for your employer. Now, when we think about returning to an existing job, this can present challenges, whether you've been away for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, or longer. And there are pros and cons to returning to a former job. Probably the biggest pro is that it's a familiar landscape, the culture and the quirks, your colleagues, the responsibilities associated with your particular role. And all of these things can mean that you won't have to spend a lot of time assessing and acclimating to a new work environment. Of course, there are also cons associated with returning to a previous job. And there's the very sneaky and sometimes insidious before cancer picture. And that can kind of play with self-confidence sometimes, right? If you find that it's taking you longer to do tasks than it did before, it's harder to focus on them. And so I encourage you to remember, to remind yourself that it's okay, that it's in fact a good idea to ease back into the routine. Remind really is an operative word here, as this is often easier said than done, but it's a helpful seed to have planted in the back of your mind. And at Cancer and Careers, we frequently hear from patients that they have a very real fear they're going to be branded as the cancer person in their office forever. And we've heard many stories from survivors about colleagues who are making cancer-related comments to them when they're returning to work. And again, typically these coworkers are very, very well intended. They're trying to connect, but it can feel off-putting if you're returning and maybe not wanting to think so much about the cancer experience that you've just had. And so what we recommend in these moments is employing a verbal technique that we call the swivel. The swivel involves directly addressing the comment that was made, inserting the word "and" in there, and then swiveling around to an area where you feel more comfortable talking. So for example, if somebody says, oh, my uncle had cancer, you might respond by saying, "I'm so sorry to hear that. That must have been hard. And while I have you here, what do you think about the meeting that we had yesterday?" Right? So it's helping the colleagues to see that you are still a robust professional, that you're able to talk about other things besides your illness, and people will usually take the clue from there. In these next few slides, we have some more examples of addressing comments. Often people will make these well-intended comments, such as a boss saying, "You've been looking so exhausted recently, I didn't want to overwhelm you by adding more to your plate." In response to that, one example on this slide, "I appreciate your concern, but work is a key part of my overall well-being. In fact, last night I had some ideas about the project that I'd love to share with you." So this is another great example of the swivel in practice. Key with the swivel is always making sure that the language sounds like you and feels like you. If any of these examples that we're running through sound and feel like you and work for you, you are welcome to steal them and use them in your workplace. But for many people, it's about talking with their loved ones, talking with their social worker, and coming up with a language that's going to feel specifically right for them. Another example of an insensitive question or comment here. And I'm not going to read through this, but what it really just drives home is this idea that you want to sit down and personally think about what your response is going to be. Maybe even write it down and practice saying it out loud, even if it's just a nagging concern in the back of your mind that maybe, possibly, unlikely, but perhaps someone might say something. That can often be a way to help relieve anxieties. Just know what you might say, what you could say. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the job search. We did a lot of webinars on job search earlier in the year. So again, I'm going to encourage you to check out the archive section of our website for true deep dives into job search. But for now, we're going to spend some time with a few more data points from our 2019 Harris poll. First three data points are responses from patients and survivors who are looking for work. And they really, what they showed us is that there is concern amongst job seekers who have been diagnosed with cancer that if prospective employers were to find out about their history, it might prevent them from getting a job. And if you then look to the bottom portion of the slide, you see two data points from some academic studies that were done, some research studies that were done, where some researchers found that people who disclosed in their cover letters we're less likely to receive interest from a potential employer than candidates who did not disclose about a disability or about their health history in any way. So essentially, those points at the bottom from the research studies, they support what we learned in our survey at the top, that it is valid to have some concern about that information being made public. So what can you do about that? Well, to start with, when you're looking for work, we encourage you to think about, the fact that it's a process. It can take a lot of time. There can be a lot of ups and downs and emotional highs and lows. And so we encourage you to really be strategic about how you're going to take care of yourself during that process. And when it comes to disclosing information, you want to think about, be strategic as well in terms of when that information gets shared, if it gets shared. You remember I said earlier that generally speaking, there's no requirement to disclose to a prospective employer, but many people feel that they want that information to be known. It's important to them that a potential employer knows that they are a cancer survivor, or that they're a cancer survivor who is still going through an experience with treatment. So we really encourage you to think about sharing that information, not in a cover letter, not on a resume, but is part of the interview process when you've already had a conversation with a hiring manager, when they've already had a chance to get a sense of what your personality is and who you are and what you bring to the table, so that they know who you are beyond the way that you present yourself on paper, because we are so much more than what we present ourselves as on paper. And often that information will land better once they have the context of a human, the full human behind it. You may also just wait to disclose if it's really important. Wait until you actually have the offer on the table, or till after you start. Again, it's always possible to share more. It's not possible to take back information once it's been shared. So you want to think about all of that carefully. Now, searching during COVID-19 obviously has some complexities as well, and we are getting short on time, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about all of these considerations, but the realities of interviewing through Zoom are different than the realities of interviewing in person. There's a lot to know there, and we actually have a phenomenal article that was recently published on our website about tips for interviewing, considerations there. Actually, I'm going to ask either Sissy or Nicole, who are on the back end providing some amazing support right now, if they could pull that link and share it in the chat so that people have access to it. That would be great. Important to know that networking is the way that most people find jobs when they're looking for them. Approximately 85% of jobs, according to many studies that I've seen, are found through networking. And know that your network is not just your former colleagues or the people that you've worked with. A professional network can really be comprised of anyone that you know. It could be somebody in your religious community. It could be your dentist. It could be the person that you find yourself standing behind in line at Starbucks, right? It's really about knowing how to share information, put it out there. LinkedIn is critical to networking. Don't have a LinkedIn profile, I strongly encourage you to build one. We have a webinar, full hour-long webinar on building an effective LinkedIn profile on our website, archived. Please take a look at that. But a LinkedIn profile, as wonderful as it is, does not replace the time-tested tools of resume and cover letter. So we have on this slide a few tips for writing resumes and cover letters. Resumes want to be succinct, easy to read, have impact. We did a webinar earlier this year called Resumes 101, and that also is archived on our website. So take a look at those for more tips. Our job search toolkit is full of example cover letters. So I encourage you to download that, order a copy of that to be sent, a hard copy of that to be sent to you, so that you can take a look at some examples there. But know generally that a cover letter should not be simply regurgitation of your resume. It's rather an opportunity to draw parallels and highlight experiences that maybe aren't included in your resume. so that you can draw the connections and show a little bit more of the dynamic flavor of who you are. And we've already talked a little bit about this disclosure piece. Should you disclose on a resume, in your cover letter, during an interview? So this reminder that it is up to you. We always want you to feel comfortable and good about the decisions that you're making in terms of sharing information or not sharing information during a job search. But we do have these studies that show that people who disclose on resumes and cover letters may run into some sticky situations. So an interview might be a better time. And then, of course, the swivel can be a wonderful tool to use during the interview process as well. Should you be asked about a gap on a resume, keep in mind that you don't have to necessarily say, well, I was going through cancer treatment and so I took time off to deal with my cancer. You could say, I was dealing with a family issue that is now resolved, and I'm thrilled to discuss how my management skills can build the team and grow your business. Speaking broadly about the cancer experience, calling it a family issue, saying I needed some time to focus on myself. These things are true, right? We don't have to share every single detail about a circumstance in order for it to be true. And so that's what we encourage here. Really, the key part is that swivel. It's moving the conversation to a place where you feel comfortable talking so that it can continue going forward. And then finally, as you're preparing for an interview, as you're thinking about places that you might potentially work, it's a good idea to do some research on your potential employer. And this is because obviously you do want to be prepared to talk about why you're interested in the job and why you think you might be a good fit for the company. But it's also, it can also be really useful to Google employers, to research them a little bit, to have an understanding of who that organization is as an entity. Do they have a history of discrimination lawsuits? If so, and discrimination is something you're concerned about, maybe you don't want to accept an offer from them. Maybe you want to have a sense of whether or not they have enough employees for you to qualify for ADA protections or for FMLA protections. So this is all the kind of information that is available online. Glassdoor.com is a wonderful resource for getting a sense of what people who work at companies have to say about the experience of working for that employer. So don't be afraid to do a little digging, because at the end of the day, when we do make the choice to work for a new employer, it's important to remember that nobody makes a hire with the intention of watching that person fail at their new job. Employers want their new employees to exceed. And so finding an environment that's going to be able to best support you, and then also knowing that you can ask for help, for support, get feedback and integrate that feedback. And really it's a wonderful way to start making a good first impression, to hit the ground in a way that is sustainably productive and positive. Don't go for 80 hours a week right out of the gate. Go for quality work, building quality relationships, and believing in yourself, and knowing that your employer wouldn't have hired you if they didn't believe in you too. So that brings us to the end of our content. No, we're at 7 o'clock, but I can certainly stay on for a little while longer if people have questions. I'm happy to answer them. This slide lists our upcoming events, a couple webinars coming up. I mentioned our West Coast Conference on Work and Cancer. We've listed here some job search resources for those of you who are searching for work, as well as some financial resources for people who may be feeling the impact of the lack of work, and additional resources with legal information as well. My contact information is there. As I mentioned, I'm happy to stay on and answer a few questions if people have the time to stay on with me. But feel free to shoot over an email to us after today's event. This is just the beginning of a conversation. And I am going to put our CEU requirements back up on the screen for those of you who need them. And while you take a look at those, I'm also going to open the Q&A box and see what we have in terms of questions. Okay. So let's see. Just scrolling through here, it looks like we have a few. Nicole, if you saw any that look particularly good that you want to point out to me, that would be great. Okay, so here's a question here that says, thank you for all the great information. Working shorter hours, for example, 6 hours instead of 8 to accommodate radiation, would this be considered a reasonable accommodation? With the expectation be being paid for 8 hours or 6 hours does it depend on the employer? So this is the situation where it's going to depend on a lot of things. And this is a great example of a question that would be better addressed to a legal expert. You definitely want to go to your employer, and it's always great if you are wanting a reasonable accommodation, whether it's scheduling or whether it's something else, to go to them with some suggestions and some thoughts, so that it doesn't feel like you're coming to the employer with a request and also asking them to come up with solutions. Having those solutions in hand is always a good move. But they, first of all, keep in mind that they might say no. It might not work for them, even if they do have a suggestion. Even if you do come to them with a suggestion, that there may have to be some sort of conversation that happens before you come to an agreement. And it is going to depend on the employer. And then I think it's also important to keep in mind that an employer might make an accommodation, even if it's not formally a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. You know, that we hear stories all the time about people who are looking for a little bit of time back in their schedule, or maybe looking for an ergonomic mouse or an ergonomic keyboard to help them with their neuropathy or whatever it might be. And the employer just does it for them, not necessarily as a reasonable accommodation under the law, but because employers want to keep their good employees happy and make sure that they continue working with them. So even if you know that you're not entitled to protections under the ADA, or if an attorney says you're not, it's always worth asking, because the worst thing they're going to say is no. Okay, so next question. Can you discuss reasonable accommodations for chemo brain for high functioning jobs? I am a program coordinator, tons of balls in the air, constant detail work. I can't seem to find a list of what accommodations would apply. So yes, so first of all, I'm going to recommend a website from the Job Accommodations Network. Sissy, if you could actually put this into the chat, it's called askjan.org is the resource. The Job Accommodation Network is it is a website that is maintained by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that lists, it's basically a database for potential accommodations for a variety of conditions. So not just cancer, but a variety of medical circumstances that might need a reasonable accommodation. And basically you can go there and you can enter in whatever you have going on, and it'll come back with some suggestions for you. So I definitely encourage you to go there if you haven't yet, to find some potential suggestions. It may be also that you look at the other diagnoses that they have listed. So maybe it's not chemo brain, but if there's memory issues or cognitive issues, it might be listed that way, depending on what specific side effects you're having that are just like incorporating your specific version of chemo brain. But in terms of my experience and what I've heard of and what I've seen done, a really useful one can sometimes be creating a process where there's somebody double checking work. I don't know if that's going to be realistic in your job. For some people, it might be. For some people, it might not be. So that would really be for you to call. But, is there a way that, you can do your work and then somebody can take a look for you? Maybe there's an intern who can do it, or maybe there's a coworker who you can tag team with in order to help get that done. Detail work checklists can often be really helpful. That's not necessarily an accommodation. That's just a tip or a practical solution. And if you think back to the chemo brain slide that I presented, that was actually all practical solutions. None of those were actually accommodations, those were all things that you could do on your own, like, you know, taking 2 minutes here or there for a little stress relief break, or taking some time to, you know, set aside a moment where your phone is off and your Slack is off and you're just focusing on what exactly that you're doing, without distractions. So, you know, doing that, making checklists so that you're going step by step with everything that you're executing so that you make sure you're not missing anything. This is also something that, and again, you know, you're saying this is kind of broadly phrased, lots of balls in the air, constant detail work. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but if you want to shoot us an email at cancerandcareers@cew.org, we can set up a time for a phone call and talk through the specifics of what you're going through and maybe come up with some suggestions for you as well. And I think, oh, look, so many more questions coming in here. Somebody has just jumped in to say, pointing out that I use job accommodation network lists and categorizes accommodations by ailment, social environment, learning accommodations, etc. So that's a better description of the Jan website than I just gave. Okay, and then here, I think this is going to be our final question since we're at almost 10 after. I've been out of work for 2 years, 1 year for treatment and 1 because of leery of COVID. How do I explain that time off and convince folks I'm ready to be back? So that's a great question. And the first thing that I will say is that, you know, after the financial recession that happened in 2008, a lot of hiring managers kind of got out of the habit of being concerned about resume gaps. Not all of them, it's not entirely gone. For some people, it is still a concern, but people have gotten used to seeing gaps on resumes for all sorts of reasons. And we're seeing a similar kind of thing happening with COVID now too. People are taking time, you know, people just, work's been complicated, finding work has been complicated. And so what I would encourage with all of that, you know, again, it's thinking about, you know, how do you frame the conversation and what part do you focus on? You know, you could very easily say, you know, well, the first year I was out of work because I needed some time to focus on myself and I was in a position to be able to do that. And then it's been complicated trying to find work because of the pandemic. And then you just swivel very quickly into why you're interested in working again. And specifically, what about that job that you're interviewing for makes you excited? And the key is really to spend more time talking about that second part, talking about what comes after the and on the swivel, rather than dwelling on explaining the gap, right? You never want to, if somebody asks you about a gap, you don't want to pretend that the question didn't get asked, right? That's not going to look good in an interview. So you definitely want to acknowledge it, but just kind of touch on it very quickly, this, that, and the other thing, and then say, you know, it's been complicated finding work because of COVID or whatever feels right for you, which is why I was so excited when this opportunity crossed my path. I admire this organization because of X, Y, and Z, and, you know, the ABC things that are listed in this particular role feed right into exactly what I've been doing, you know, and just really selling that piece of it, selling why you're a savvy candidate for the job, selling why this role really gets you excited and going and what you're going to bring to the table. And that enthusiasm, if you really are having that level of, you know, enthusiasm about being back at work, that readiness to be back, communicating that, spending more time with that, that'll come through. You know, the way that when we're genuine, people know. So that would be my advice there. And again, okay, so we're now at 7-Eleven. I'm going 7-Eleven Eastern time, I should say. So I will leave it off here for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, for those of you who will be requesting CEUs, that email is going to go out by 5 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow, Thursday. For those of you who are well, I guess we're at Wednesday, so I won't quite say have a good weekend yet, but I hope you do have a good weekend. I hope you enjoy the rest of this beautiful September week that we're having, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much.